What's up, guys and gals? Welcome back to another, well, they're not really video logs anymore. They're more just topical commentary at this point. Welcome on back, though. It's time for another splatter chat, and this one's going to be a little bit more structured. Maybe not more structured, but I think it's probably going to be a little bit more topical than normal. And that's one of the things that I very much like about starting this series up, is that it allows me to just talk about things that I find to be interesting that have been going on in my personal business with the YouTube channel and the Twitch TV and the Roll For It and all that kind of stuff. And actually, talking about Roll For It, that's what today is going to be all about. I wanted to put together a Dungeon Masters series. So essentially, you're going to play D&D. And you've been voted the Dungeon Master, and some of the things that should be included in your thought process, and maybe some of my thoughts, having now DM'd for, I've been working on the Roll For It campaign. For those of you that don't know, I'm actually part of a Twitch stream called Twitch TV/Roll For It. It's called Roll For It. It's me, Avik, Enter Elysium, Bentham, and Shenrer. We play D&D every single week, and we also play Dark Heresy every single week. We used to just play Dark Heresy, and so I was purely a player up until a couple of months ago, and then I ended up being the GM for the D&D 5th edition campaign, and there's been a lot of hard lessons that I've had to learn throughout the process of being the GM. They don't really tell you how to do it, and whereas I've had experience playing AD&D and GMing it, I've GM'd 3.5, I've GM'd 4th edition. It's been years since I had actually had an opportunity to GM anything, and so 5th edition was a new system for me. It was a new experience for me, and it was the cause of some anxiety when I first sat down and started putting my thoughts on paper for the way that I wanted to develop a campaign and keep my players and my audience entertained. And so in order to lubricate your process, let's say that you're sitting down right now, and if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you're either interested in my thought process, or B, that maybe you are thinking about running a D&D campaign yourself as the Dungeon Master. And so I've sat down, and over the last day or two, I've kind of collated some points and put them down on a piece of paper as to what you want to be aware of before you start this adventure. Because believe me, whereas GMing is kind of like being the unsung hero of a campaign, it can be very, very rewarding when done right, and it can be the source of tremendous stress when done wrong, depending on how much weight you put on entertaining the people that you're playing the game with. I personally think that D&D is probably one of the greatest creations that mankind has come up with in the last 50 years or so. Forget about fusion reactors and going to the moon and all that kind of stuff. It's D&D. That's what I vote for. It's D&D. Because D&D is essentially a playground for kids, adults, everyone alike can get into D&D at different levels, and it allows you, our culture doesn't really allow people a lot of opportunities to play pretend as adults, and we're lucky that as part of the current generation, that's starting to ease back, and that play and that being allowed to have playtime and pretend and be adults role-playing at something is no longer considered to be a nerdy thing. And so anyways, as a semi-new GM, I wanted to teach you some of the lessons that I've learned over the course of my experience here with Roll For It. And so anyways, I got a couple of points here. I can't say this is going to be tremendously entertaining, but I'm hoping that it'll be educational in some regards, because I learned these lessons the hard way. Basically, I ground this out, and I've been working, I don't think a lot of people know. So my first point is that I don't think a lot of people know really the preparation that goes into a D&D campaign if you're really, really obsessive about it like I am. Some people are great at improvising, and they can just throw something down on paper and they just roll with the punches. I'm not one of those people. I have to be very, very prepared before I go in. Otherwise, I just turn into a giant stress ball and I lose sleep over it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to some of the people you might be DMing for, and then I'll give you my brief thoughts about how you can incorporate them into a campaign and what that means for the way that you want to write your story and the way that you want to orchestrate your game. The first group and the most obvious one are the newbies. They tend to come to your table wet behind the ears without any knowledge about the game. If you're really lucky, they'll have a player handbook, and they will have thumbed through it at some point. That's my experience with DMing for new players, is that you're going to have to handhold them a little bit. But it's not as bad as it sounds, because honestly, new players offer you a plethora of opportunities with the way that you can interact with them, because you've got a blank slate, which is a really, really rare opportunity to set someone's expectations for what role play is. Players that come into the game knowing what they're doing often have a baseline level of boredom or cynicism, or just kind of the overwhelming feeling that they've seen it all, and because of that, they can get themselves into all kinds of trouble throughout their campaign just trying to do something unique or interesting, because they've seen it all before. They've collected more artifacts and leveled up more characters than they could possibly describe on a ream of paper. But with a new player, you don't have that. New players tend to be both receptive they're receptive to information from the DM. They're apprehensive and overwhelmed by the freedom of what a gaming table represents, because very, very few people have actually played a tabletop game before And it comes with a tremendous amount of freedom, a freedom that can almost be restricting, ironically, if you don't know what you're doing. And so it's fun interacting with newbies because you can give them little pushes and be like, okay, well, this is the part where you would respond, and what does your character think about that? How would your character react to this situation? And if you've ever had a really good D&D group that gelled on both an RP, combat, mechanical, and just, I guess, amicable level at a table, you'll know that you want to recreate that experience as much as possible. And with newbies, you have the chance to basically form them into the type of player that is fun to play with by curbing negative behaviors very, very quickly and promoting the positive ones. With a newbie campaign, I mean, I'm not assuming that you'll have a full group of newbies, but it happens from time to time. I've DM'd groups of 4 or 5 people that had no idea what they're doing. They just wanted to play D&D for the first time and hang out on a Friday night for a couple weeks straight. For new players, I would keep it simple. I would stick to well-established fantasy tropes and let them have the time they need in order to insert themselves into a world and learn how to roleplay. Because with the experience that I've had as a DM, with new players, they tend to be like, oh my god, all this freedom, what do I do? And so you can prompt them and be like, okay, well, on a piece of paper, what does your character care about? Where is your character from? What was your character's job before he became a adventurer? What experiences were a part of that life that he lived? Where are his parents from? What kind of upbringing did he have? Had them kind of fill out a little story on a piece of paper, and actually the nice thing about D&D now is that it incorporates this through the use of its got its origin system now, where you choose if you were a charlatan or a criminal or whatever, and you get stat bonuses based on that, and then you roll some dice to fill out the background of the character. I actually love that as a new player tool because it takes a lot of the prompting off of the DM before you even start playing. But yeah, if you're playing with newbies, just take it slow. Introduce them to simple storylines that they can work their way through, give them a couple of characters that they can draw on as resources, and as they get better at the game, expand the playing field and give them more and more freedom. But at the beginning, keep them in tightly confined spaces. I don't know, maybe they're trapped inside of a massive castle prison or something like that that has an established set of rules. They are prisoners. Lunch is at this time. They now have an adventure. Maybe they're trying to escape. Maybe they're trying to prove their innocence, but they have to do it inside a confined area that they can't really escape from. And once that storyline's over, release them into the greater world now that they've learned how to RP and interact with an imaginary world, essentially. So the second group that I would talk about are comedians, because this is a pretty common group at the gaming table as well. If a player's a comedian, they're going to go out of their way to make everything as funny and or entertaining as possible while they play the game. And while that doesn't sound like an issue, when you're writing a storyline, if you've got a table full of people that just want to have a good time, make some jokes, get into ridiculous shenanigans and situations with their characters, you'll want to tailor the campaign around that. It's very, very hard to have a group of comedians in a campaign that is built to be super grimdark, because everything that they do reduces the gravitas of the situation that you're trying to cultivate in your campaign. If you're living in a dark world where people are morose and bad things are happening, and kind of there's just that level of you know what I'm talking about when you watch like a war movie or whatever, and they suck all the color out of the screen and everything's like varying shades of washed out greens and grays and stuff like that. If you're trying to cultivate a campaign that's dark like that, the comedian through his actions sort of sucks that out and infuses color into the world. And so if you know that you've got a table that's full of comedians, my recommendation would be to write a campaign that allows for goofiness, because grim, dark worlds where there's consequences and nasty monsters and beasties everywhere, characters that treat things in a jovial fashion or a lighthearted way tend to get stomped out pretty quickly with like their goofy, oh, well, why don't I just break into the house while singing a song because I'm the bard? You've got to let them know that there are constraints to that, and it's easier actually just to design the campaign around comedic characters. Put them in a lighthearted world where maybe the consequences are not so dire for the things that they do. Put them in a world where their goofiness allows them to generate a certain level of fame, perhaps, you know, or maybe the goofiness of the way that they report themselves. Maybe ask them to create a troupe of gnomes or halflings or races that are known for being jovial in that fashion. So when they get into goofy shenanigans, the people in your world react to it as though like, oh, those halflings, like they expect that behavior because there's a stereotype about the races that they're playing. But the comedians can also be a source for a lot of fun in your group. I mean, you've always got that player who you'll be in a really dire situation and they'll just have like that one-liner or that course of action that is just so ridiculously goofy and over the top that somehow it just works for the situation because all hope is lost. So they say, Hail Mary, and they decide to do something super just ridiculous in order to solve the problem. So don't discount the comedian. Just be aware that if you've got a full group of comedians playing in your campaign, perhaps give them something a little bit more lighthearted, or at the bare minimum, something where the consequences for their actions are reduced slightly so that they don't feel punished for having a good time. Power gamers would be the next group that I would talk about. Power gamers are kind of like hand grenades in the middle of your campaign if you don't deal with them in the proper way. For people that don't know, power gaming is essentially going through and trying to make your character as optimized as possible within the rules and the confines of the game. And in fact, power gamers can ruin a campaign if you leave them unchecked among a group of players that are not power gamers, because they tend to be so powerful and so overpowered that they tend to solve all the combat situations all by their lonesome without help from the group. And that doesn't make for a particularly fun set of circumstances if you're part of the group that doesn't get to participate in combat because this guy over here has spun around with his two-handed sword beheading everything on his first turn. And it's a difficult situation to fix with power gamers because you can't challenge them without destroying the rest of the group because they are not optimized in the same way that he is. So if you have a power gamer at your table, the first thing that I would appraise is how many people at the table are power gamers. If you've got a full table full of power gamers, nobody else is of any other type, or if they are, power gaming is what is important to them, that's fantastic. Design yourself just a ridiculous Dark Souls-esque challenging campaign where you just throw the book at them, because I find that that's where power gamers have the most fun. They want to see their character succeed at things that normally would not be attainable by normal unoptimized characters. However, if your table only has one power gamer at it and everybody else is just your average gamer or role players, or they're more interested in the storyline aspects or just having a good time, I think there's a conversation to be had right there. And actually, it's been my experience over the course of my life DMing that if you just sit down and talk to a power gamer and be like, hey man, so your character is ridiculously more powerful than everybody else in the campaign, and we're running the risk right now of making everybody else feel bored or overshadowed or whatever. What do you think we could do here to mitigate this? If you sit down and you have that conversation with that player at your table, I mean, I guess people can feel free to argue, but when I've had that conversation with people, it's almost always gone over fine. We sit down, we have a conversation, we compromise. Maybe they dial back their character a tiny bit, or they work on something as with regards to their character design that's a bit more RP or a bit more narrative focused instead of just purely combat. And in general, I've found that if you sit down, you address the issue up front, and you try to come to a compromise, it's worked out fine. But if you don't address it and you just let that power gamer do their thing in an otherwise normally tailored campaign, it could definitely be a source of some chagrin for both yourself as a DM and for other players, because once the ball gets rolling, it can be a very, very difficult thing to curtail. Murder hobos. This is going to be a fun group. Murder hobos. So those of you who don't play D&D enough to know what a murder hobo is, murder hobos are essentially vagrant characters. It's basically a play on words for how a lot of people play D&D. You're a homeless character who just solves all of their problems through murdering whoever is in your way. And I've seen a lot of groups that actually play like this, and I didn't know it was called murder hobo until about 3 or 4 months ago when I was trying to appraise my strategy for running roll for it. And so a group of players that are murder hobos probably don't care a whole lot about the storyline of the campaign or the way that they interact with the world or anything like that. The best way to DM for murder hobos is just to really get out of the way. You can either try to correct their behavior and be like, no, you're not allowed to murder this guy because there are laws inside the village that you are currently in. If you do that, the magistrate will send bounty hunters after you, and they will come to capture you because you are now a criminal, because you're not allowed to just murder anybody that has the objective that you're trying to accomplish. Alternatively, if you don't mind, murder hobos tend to kind of be mixed in with comedians a lot of the time, and so the comedian strategy of making a lighthearted campaign that has a low amount of consequences and also doesn't have a really, really heavy world or anything like that, light on narrative and that sort of thing, just give them a quest and get the hell out of the way, tends to be the best way to do it for murder hobos. And in fact, I usually wouldn't even give them an overworld to mess around with. I would frame it with regards to here's a big dungeon, you were given the quest by this guy, yes, there will be NPCs in the dungeon, but because you're inside of a dungeon, there's no prevailing law or anything like that. And so yeah, if you murder this guy in the dark corner of the dungeon to get the key for the door that you need, nobody really cares, and then everybody has fun and they run their way through it. But watch out for murder hobos in your groups of comedians, because a sense of humor can quickly roll over into just being I think it would be hilarious to set everyone on fire, so that's what I'm going to do. The next group you probably have to contend with at one point or another is not actually a group, it's just an individual player most of the time in your campaign. It's the Mary Sue. If you don't do a lot of literary analysis, or you don't read a lot of books, or if you just don't know what a Mary Sue is, that's perfectly fine. I'm about to tell you. A Mary Sue is a player in your group who naturally wants their storyline to take the limelight. They want to be the main character of the group. And because D&D is a social activity where you've got an entire group of people who probably have their own aspirations, ambitions, backstories, and stuff like that, this can cause a little bit of friction. Mary Sues will often try to, basically in the tug of war of the party dynamic, they will almost always try to pull everyone over to their side to only work on their storyline, to take the limelight as much as possible. And much like the Power Gamer, the Mary Sue is kind of like the Power Gamer of storyline development. They want to optimize their storyline at the detriment of everybody else's. The gameplay mechanic side, they probably play perfectly normally, but the Mary Sue is kind of like the Power Gamer of the narrative. In order to curtail this, I would just sit down and talk to the player one more time and be like, listen, there's a lot of people at the table. You can't be the center of attention all the time. I will try to knock the tennis ball of the narrative catalyst over to your side every now and again so that you can take it and run with it for a little while. But just be aware that I have to come up with a storyline and a narrative for everybody here at the table, not just you. And you constantly having to be the center of attention detracts from everybody else, and you're causing them to not have as much fun. It's a conversation you will have to sit down and have if it's to the detriment of the group. And most of the time, like I said with Power Gamers, most people are willing to acquiesce once they realize that they're being disruptive in the group. Alternatively, there is an upshot to Mary Sue's. Characters that play like this can actually be very, very helpful if you've got a group of newbies. If you have all new players, use the Mary Sue. Use the Mary Sue in your group to be the fuel that lights their fire. New players will oftentimes have trouble getting into the storyline or taking the initiative and being like, oh, well, I want to pursue this ambition for my character. The Mary Sue can be useful as a quest giver, essentially, for the rest of the group if it becomes that way, because oftentimes with new players, they'll need a little bit of pushing or goading. The nice thing about the Mary Sue is that they always want the storyline to revolve around them, but everybody else in the group isn't assertive enough to RP and try to develop their own storyline. So some of the time you can actually use the Mary Sue in your group as that character to push them all along and get along the path to the storyline and give them something engaging. It could give them something to work on since they don't know what to work on for themselves. They can be like, oh, well, this character over here, Mary Sue, she seems to know what she wants in life. Will be enablers for her during the campaign. So it's not all down right there. Sometimes Mary Sue players can be very, very helpful. So keep that in your little bag of DM tricks. The Rule Monkey. Now, the Rule Monkey is one of those ones that particularly, this is my pet peeve right here. The Rule Monkey is the guy that sits the entire campaign with his nose down the book and corrects the DM, corrects other players, and just nonstop is like, no, we have to do everything by the book. Everything has to be precisely by the book. Otherwise, I can't be happy and I can't enjoy this campaign. And the reason I'm actually a little bit more animated about this guy is because he is my personal nemesis as a DM. As a DM, I tend to be very, very loosey-goosey. I don't memorize a lot of the rules. I don't memorize the grapple rules. I don't memorize this, that, or the other. I'm more than happy as a DM if it makes the game flow properly to just hand wave it, so long as it's not to the detriment of the party. And what I mean by that is sometimes hand waving can actually nerf the party members and make them feel less important. If they've got special abilities that actually affect the thing that they're trying to do, using the proper mechanics might help them to shine brightest. And so hand waving that hurts them. But in my opinion as a DM, if it doesn't hurt anybody, I will hand wave a rule in order to make the game flow smoothly and just be like, give me a dex check instead of doing like the super complicated stuff while you're sitting. I mean, if it's going to take me 15 different checks and looking at a bunch of tables in order to make the game flow, I'm just going to hand wave it and be like, give me a dexterity check and then give me an acrobatics check back to back. And if you succeed on both of those, I don't care how complicated the book lays it out, congratulations, you succeed. And so if it's not to the detriment of the player, I tend to get annoyed really, really quickly with the Rule Monkey. That's just me personally. The way that you deal with the Rule Monkey is essentially just to lay down the law as the GM and be like, listen, if you don't like the way that I'm running my campaign, do me a favor and take down a list of all the things that I got wrong during the session, write them down on a piece of paper for me, and then reference the rule book where you want me to fix that, and I will do my best to read through all of the protestations that you've made after the session, and I'll try to make it run a little bit more smoothly since this seems to really, really bother you with regards to the mechanic. But understand that when you do that, sometimes I, as a DM, I'm just going to hand wave things because it makes the game run smoother. Or sometimes I don't want to take the time to have an argument about the interpretation of the rules. Instead, as the DM, I have the right on any ruling to just be like, this is the way it's going to function for right now. We'll have this conversation on Skype or after the game has concluded tonight, but we're not going to do it right here at the table. I would say when you have a rule monkey at your table, just be very, very firm with them, and if they can't deal with that, then maybe they're not playing at the proper table. And while that's not an option that I normally like to exercise, I'm not the type of DM that is like, well, then you can't play with me. I don't like to take my ball and go home, because my job is to help you have fun. But at a certain point, there are incompatibilities with the way people want the game to function. And if a person at your table wants everything to be very much by the book, and you're not a by the book DM, then at a certain point, you're going to have to bring up with that player that maybe our play styles are not compatible. But there are, like, for example, what I gave you previously, there are ways to try to compromise and meet in the middle, so consider that. However, the Rule Monkey is also, much like the Mary Sue, the Rule Monkey is not always a downer. Rule Monkeys tend to also know a lot about the game and have a lot of things memorized. And so as a DM, it can be a pretty helpful tool sometimes when you really, really, really need to know the mechanic of how something functions to be like, Rule Monkey, please enlighten the rest of the group how this works. And you can actually do it in kind of an underhanded way that doesn't show you don't know what you're talking about too a lot of the time. If you know that somebody loves explaining rules, as the DM, be like, all right, so you want to use this mechanic, but instead of me explaining to you how it works, go ahead, Rule Monkey, you explain it to him. And do it in a totally just conversational tone. And this gives the guy that's really, really into the rules an opportunity to show off his rule knowledge and also help the rest of the group learn how to play the game better. And also, if you don't know the mechanic, you kind of just tricked him into telling you the mechanic without undermining your authority as the DM by making yourself look like an idiot. So, just something to keep in mind, just another thing for the DM tool bag, just another thing to think about. The next player type that I'd like to talk about is the Voyager, because this one's going to be really, really, really important if you're writing a campaign. The Voyager is the player that never wants to do any quest the way that you're kind of telegraphing it should be done. As a DM, when you write a storyline, you tend to get a structure, you have like a flow chart, this leads to this. They can get around it in certain ways at certain plot points. They can kind of work their way around that without doing it the way as intended. But the Voyager is the player who will consistently never take quest queues ever. They will strike out into the hills and dales trying to find an alternate route to completing every single objective you put in front of them, no matter what you do. And as a DM, if you're the kind of person that has carefully laid plans and a little bit of Deus Ex Machina in your campaign, this can be frustrating. But as a DM, you can't get frustrated about it because they are playing the game exactly as it is meant to be played. Most players will take the quest and they'll see what's indicated. The quest giver will be like, I think you should talk to this person. And they will go and they will talk to that person because it's the obvious next step. The Voyager is the guy that says, fuck that. And he goes to some weird alternate means to solve every problem, and he's allowed to do that. So try to keep yourself from getting frustrated with this player, and instead, if you've got a group of players that don't take quest queues like that, and they just do whatever they're gonna do, but they still make progress towards completing the quest by doing it in outlandish or unplanned ways, you plan for that by not planning. And while improvisation is a tough skill, for this player, it's the only thing that's going to bail you out. Because they are not going to play by the rules of the game that you tried to put in front of them, nor should they have to. If they want to solve the quest in a creative way, DM, it's your job to facilitate that. You can't railroad them into solving the quest the way that you want them to. And so the way that I would deal with that is I would just make all of my campaigns very, very open-ended. If I have a group of players that don't like to follow the path that I set out for them, I would stop setting out that path. I would give them quest objectives with very, very little guidance, and I would just improvise the rest. Create a list of NPCs that are just randomly already pre-assembled, like sheriffs, magistrates, jailers, civilians, reliquarians, mages. Just have a list of characters already prepared that you can just look at your piece of paper and be like, all right, so you're going to meet with the alchemist, whose name is, and you've already got it all filled out on the paper, and then you just have them, according to your quest structure, lead the players in the right way. They feel satisfied because they didn't take the quest queue and they solved it in a unique and curious way. You feel satisfied because you didn't waste hours and hours and hours writing a bunch of shit that they're just going to ignore. Anyways, at the end of the day, this was really just a talk to encourage you to speak with your players. If that's the one thing that I could actually tell you to do before you start DMing, it's when you get your Dungeons and Dragons group, sit down with them, and during character creation, note the way that they go about creating their character, and you should be able to lock down what type of player they are. And you know, at the end of the day, for all the things that I've put down here, you can really kind of divide people into 4 categories. And in fact, somebody else made this realization long before I did, a guy named Glenn Blackow. He actually divided all players of D&D up into role players, storytellers, power gamers, and war gamers. And every single player would be some combination of those 4. And so I know we had a little bit of fun here, and I was talking about individual player types that you may have seen at your table and kind of offering you advice on how to deal with them. But my final piece of advice is simply talk to your players. Figure out what kind of players they are, what they want out of their campaign before you even start writing anything. And once you've got that, you can then tailor a campaign that will make everybody at the table happy. This has been a Splatter Chat briefly. This is going to be actually a special Splatter Chat, intro to DMing, I guess. As I learn lessons, I will bequeath them unto you. This is number 1, which is simply speak with your players. Speak with your Don't make the mistake of not talking to them. I promise you'll regret it. I will see you all next time. If you enjoy what I do here on the channel, be sure to check out the Patreon down below to enable me to create more fun thingies for you, because in fact, that's how this series got created. It would not exist if it wasn't for the generosity of everybody that has decided to subsidize my existence on the internet. So I will see you all in the next Splatter Chat, more than likely next week. Bye, everybody.